Imagine if you could build a psychological blueprint of a presidential candidate, one so detailed that you could actually predict their leadership style before they even got into office. Well, back in 2017, a study tried to do exactly that. Let's dig into how they did it and what they found. And this is really the big question, isn't it? Is it actually possible to analyze a public figure from afar and forecast how they'll behave when they're in one of the most powerful jobs in the world? That is the bold idea this study decided to put to the test. So how in the world do you build a psychological profile of someone you've never even met? Well, this wasn't just some random guesswork. The researchers used a very specific, structured academic process to comb through a mountain of public information. The method they used has a bit of a fancy name, psychodiagnostic meta-analysis, but the idea behind it is pretty fascinating. It's basically a way of doing a personality assessment at a distance. So instead of a face-to-face interview, researchers just systematically analyze everything that's publicly available. We're talking news reports, interviews, books, to find consistent patterns of behavior. The whole process really boiled down to 3 key steps. First, they collected a ton of data. They looked at over 600 different sources. Then they took all that info and synthesized it, scoring it against a standardized framework called the Millen Inventory to categorize personality patterns. And finally, using that scored profile, they started making some specific predictions about what kind of leader this person would be. All right, so after all that digging and analyzing, what did the profile actually show? Well, this study zeroed in on 4 major personality patterns that really formed the core of this person's psychological blueprint. Let's take a look at exactly what they were.
And here it is. This is the actual profile chart right from the paper. Now, don't worry about all the different lines. Just look right here. You can see 4 really clear peaks that are way higher than all the others. These 4 dominant traits are the statistical foundation for everything else we're about to talk about.
You should think of the final profile not as one single thing, but more like a composite, a blend of these 4 dominant traits. Each one adds a different flavor to the overall picture of their personality and ultimately their leadership style. The key is understanding how they all mix together. So the first dominant trait they identified was ambitious. The study uses this to describe someone who is, super competitive and self-assured. These are the kinds of people who are very comfortable taking charge and really expect other people to see them as special. The second trait is dominant. This one is all about enjoying power and being in control. The profile describes these individuals as tough, not very sentimental, and really focused on directing others and getting respect. Third up, we have outgoing. This points to a personality that just loves being the center of attention. Dramatic, socially confident, but, and this is a really key point, the profile also notes that they can get bored very, very easily, especially with routine stuff. And the final piece of the puzzle is what the study calls the dauntless trait. This describes a tendency to go against tradition and a real dislike for routine. But the study also points out something critical here. An inclination to be unconventional and sometimes to elaborate on or shade the truth. So, we've got these 4 pretty powerful traits, but the study argues that they don't just exist in a vacuum. The real secret sauce here is how they interact with each other to create a very specific and predictable composite leadership style. For instance, what happens when you combine the ambitious and dominant traits? Well, the paper says it creates a kind of self-assured, daring aggressiveness. It's a really potent combination that the researchers pointed out is actually pretty common among super successful leaders, whether they're in the military, sports, or politics. And then what happens when you mix outgoing and dauntless? According to the study, that combination can lead to a more complicated interpersonal style, one it describes as potentially scheming, calculating, and deceitful, where social skills might be used for more than just getting attention. Okay, so this brings us right back to that first big question. The profile was built, the traits were combined, and the predictions were made, all back in 2017. So, how did those forecasts actually hold up against reality? Let's see what the study found when it looked back. Let's start with a predicted strength. The profile suggested that this leader's absolute greatest asset would be his ability to mobilize his supporters. And sure enough, the study's follow-up cites an observer saying, to go into those campaign rallies and connect with people he wasn't at all like, that takes a certain genius. Pretty spot on. Now, what about the predicted challenges? The study forecast a leadership style that would not be deliberative. And the follow-up research found this really came to life in some high-stakes situations. Reports documented that the president was often so unprepared for calls with foreign leaders that staff had to coach him during the calls themselves. And this ties right into another prediction they made about attention to detail. Remember that outgoing trait and the susceptibility to boredom? The study later cited sources stating that almost never would Trump read the briefing materials prepared for him. It shows a really clear, consistent pattern of behavior, exactly what the profile suggested would happen. So what's the big takeaway from all this? The study makes the case that this isn't just about one person. It's really a powerful argument for why personality and temperament are so incredibly important when it comes to high-stakes leadership. Based on that initial profile, the study actually laid out several key limitations or, vulnerabilities that a leader with these traits might face. Things like having a pretty superficial grasp of complex issues, a tendency to act impulsively, and a habit of choosing personal loyalty over actual competence, all potential weak spots that stem directly from that core personality structure. At the end of the day, the paper argues that beyond policy or politics, the single most important factor for understanding this kind of leadership is temperament. The researchers concluded that this specific mix of traits created a really unique and potentially perilous combination for anyone in that office. And all of this leaves us with one last big question to think about. This study makes a really compelling case for the predictive power of this kind of psychological profiling, and it kind of forces us to ask ourselves, how much weight should we be giving to things like personality, character, and temperament when we choose our leaders?